Okay, cool. Welcome, everyone. We just got a couple of you here, and that's fine. My name is Dave from SkillForge. We're just going to talk about Angular here in this webinar. And first of all, thanks for coming. Thanks for taking time out of your day to come take a look. Also, during the webinar, there should be like a Q&A panel, question and answer panel. So if you have any questions while I'm doing this, feel free to type in those questions there, and I'll do my best to pay attention. And if I miss it, I'll check every once in a while, and we'll make sure to get any questions that you've answered. But that's the main point of this, is just to give kind of an intro to Angular, the class that we teach here at SkillsForge, and kind of what we do and what we learn. And we'll talk a little bit about Angular, and then we'll hop into an actual project and build a quick little project that shows how to pull some data from the internet and kind of pull it into your app. So again, any questions, just let me know. Type those out, and here we go. So this is me, just really quick. I'm just a technical trainer with SkillForge. I've been teaching web design and development for over 10 years. I got 4 kids, keeps me young, right? My wife, and I love teaching. I just feel like that's kind of is my calling. I love to see people take the things I give them and teach them and help them with, and watch them flourish with it, whether it's in a higher educational setting or whether it's here at SkillForge. I just like to be able to help people to learn difficult material. I teach all the web design development classes here at SkillForge. We have plenty of them. We got, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the 3 core languages there. Classes on Vue and Angular, Node, and CSS, and all kinds of different things there. So, and around the end of the webinar, we'll take a look if you want to continue on and learn some more. I come from a higher educational background, but I was hired on by SkillForge to basically keep teaching similar things that I was teaching before. Quick stuff about SkillForge. It's been in business since 2010. We have over 120 different live instructor-led courses. We do them online, we do them on site, just depends on whoever needs what. We've had over 5,000 students from 3,000 different companies attend our classes, and we deliver trainings to anyone that wants to be trained, basically. And some of our clients down there, you can kind of see at the bottom. So we just do our best to make sure that what we teach is what people need, and get them trained up on the stuff that they need for their businesses and their jobs. Okay, so let's hop into Angular. Let's get through the PowerPoint stuff as quick as we can, then we'll actually get into how to use it and how to make a quick little app. But the big thing with Angular is it was created and it's maintained by Google. So it has a huge company backing this language. A lot of people are using it. It's getting more and more popular, but it's a JavaScript framework. In other words, it uses JavaScript code in a certain way to deliver and create these SPAs on the second bullet point there, single page apps. So, and what that is basically, it's a whole website that is created on one page, but it intelligently hides pages and shows pages when you click on different links to make it feel like it's a website, when really it's just one page that's being delivered to you through different pieces. And those pieces are called components, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, but that's kind of the key point with Angular, is just how these components are created and how they're used to put content on the page. If you're familiar with HTML, you already know a good chunk of what you need for Angular. Angular serves up HTML into these pages, and it uses specific tags or elements to be able to show these components on the page. And so it kind of, the thing about Angular is it takes what hopefully a web designer is already familiar with, and it keeps running with those concepts, and it allows you to keep using what you're already familiar with to build these things in Angular. Scales really well. In other words, if you have tons and tons of different pages, different components, you can easily update them, where if it was just a static HTML page, you'd have to go into hundreds of pages and update them that way, and it just makes it a lot harder. And just like if you've used jQuery at all, Angular does a similar thing. jQuery allows you to do pretty difficult things in JavaScript and it makes it a lot easier. Angular is kind of the same way. It just makes things a lot easier to do, which used to be a lot harder. Looping through objects and arrays and things like that, and connecting to databases and pulling data from the web, which is what we're going to do in our example. Angular just makes those complex actions a little bit easier than they used to be. Okay, so features of Angular framework. It's cross-platform. You can develop on Mac, Linux, Windows. It doesn't matter. The code that's generated is optimized to run as quickly as possible. Okay, we got components. You can build the website piece by piece. The productivity, you'll see that today in the demo where it uses the Angular CLI, which is the command line interface. In other words, it gives you a bunch of commands that you can type in to create different parts of your Angular app. And the big one also is partnership, right? Google is working hand in hand with Microsoft with their Visual Studio Code editor, which we'll go over here in a minute. And they're making sure that Microsoft is making sure the Visual Studio Code does everything that the Angular language needs. So the Angular framework. And that's pretty cool to have these two big companies working together to make sure that this Angular framework can work as well as possible and that the editor can support that framework as good as it can. Okay, testing helps a lot too. When you run into problems, debug messages come up in very helpful places. There's a whole built-in tool called Karma that allows you to do testing as well. So how to get started with Angular. I'm going to show all this. I'm going to demo this in a minute, but the big one is getting a text editor. The big text editor that's recommended is Visual Studio, like I mentioned, but there's other ones. Atom is another one, ATOM. And Brackets is a pretty good one, but I would say Brackets is a little more useful for just the front end stuff. When you get into these frameworks, most of the developers nowadays are using Visual Studio. Okay. You need node.js, and there's the website there as well. Again, I'm going to show all this in the demo. But Node just allows you to use this thing called Node Packet Manager, which allows you to install a bunch of different plugins and packages that basically enhance the functionality of your app. And once you have that, and we're actually going to use the Node Package Manager, or NPM, to install the Angular CLI, the command line interface. Okay. But we'll go over this in the demo here. All right, so to build the app, it almost feels like you have to go back in time a little bit. We are back using DOS. We're back using the command prompt. We're back typing in commands and having things run. So it's kind of interesting. And so that's what we'll be doing here. And what we'll be building is an app that goes out and gets just a Star Wars quote. I'm a nerdy guy. I'm a simple guy, and there's an API out there that will get you just a random quote from Star Wars. So that's what we'll do. Go out there, grab the quote, throw it into our app. Okay, and we'll need to do this in the command prompt. Now, I'm probably going to refer back to this back and forth here as we go. I tried to make kind of a visual representation of what we're going to build. Okay, we see right here we got the index.html, and then we have a bunch of components. We have an app module over here, an API service. If you've never used Angular before, a lot of these terms may sound new, but I'll do my best, to explain them. And like I said, make sure you ask if you have any questions. But think of it as basically a building, right? Inside of a building, you have a bunch of floors. On those floors, you have different offices. And then in those offices, you have just a bunch of different rooms. So an Angular app is really similar to that. We can think of index.html as like the building, right? It's the thing that holds everything. Okay, then inside of that building, we have an office called app component. Okay, and it uses the app root tag, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And that basically gets embedded by index. So index takes the app root component, which is basically the whole app, and it embeds and displays it inside of itself. Okay, and then you can embed components inside of components. And so you have this app component that holds the whole application, and then inside of that you have basically pieces or rooms, if we go back to the building analogy. And one of those is quote, right? So we're going to build like a room inside of this office called quote, and we're going to embed it and put it inside of that office. Okay, and then out here you have like services. This would be like, say your business, I don't know, makes baby toys or something, and you in that building, you don't actually build them. You need another service to do that. So you have to call out and contract out to other companies to basically say, look, we need you guys to build this, and then we'll box it up and ship it out or whatever. So these are what these services would do, or these modules, where you have what you're doing in here. Inside, we're trying to pull a quote and show it, but you can't do it. A component by itself can't do that. So it has to go out there and contract to this service and say, hey, you go out there, grab the information for us so we can display it. So that's basically what's happening here. These aren't really part of the component. These are just things that the component uses. Now, if this feels a little confusing, don't worry. I will come back and I will point these out as we make these. But the whole point of this is I just wanted to give you kind of a visual representation of what we're going to build before we do it. And then once we start building it and we're putting in the code, I'll come back here and we'll talk about this as needed. Okay. All right. All right, so way we start out is, well, we need our editor, right? And the editor that we're going to need to go with, that I'm going to be using, is Visual Studio Code, the website code.visualstudio.com. You go there, it should detect what operating system you're on. So from here, you know, if you're on Mac and it doesn't come up, well, there's a Mac version, there's a Linux version, there's a Windows. So the download and installs are really, really simple. You just download the file, run it, and you don't need to change any of the default settings. You just run the install and do your thing. Just go through it and it installs and you're done. Okay, so nothing too crazy there. Same thing with Node, actually. You just go to their website, nodejs.org, and you can I usually get the current. I haven't found any issues with grabbing that one. Just grab the current version, and same thing. You just download it and install it. You don't need to change any of the default settings or anything. It just installs. And the main thing that we care about with Node is that we get the NPM, the Node Package Manager. That's going to allow us to download and install all the things that we need to. Okay. The other thing, just as a reference, is this is Angular's website, so angular.io. You can go there, check out their documentation. That's going to tell you all the different things that the language can do and things like that. So, and then we'll come back to this later, but this is going to be the API that we're going to be pulling from. It's really simple API. All it's doing, let me make this a little bigger. All it's doing is it's just providing us with a Star Wars quote. And it's just completely random. Sometimes it's Han Solo, sometimes it's Qui-Gon, sometimes it's characters that I've actually never heard of. So, but every time I refresh, every time we access this API, it's going to give us a different random quote. All right, so let's get started. So once those are installed, yeah, now all we got to do is just kind of hop into a command prompt. Now, before I do this, though, I'm gonna want to create. I'm just gonna create a folder here on the desktop. Okay, call this whatever, but this is going to be like where I put, maybe I want, if I'm working on multiple apps, I'm just going to put them all in this folder. Now to start out in the command prompt, you got to tell the command prompt where you're going to be working, like what folders you're going to be working inside and such. So I found the easiest way to do that is basically open up the folder. Okay, once that folder's open, then I can just click up here and I can just grab the path, and I'm going to copy that. And then I come over here, type in CD, that's change directory. Then I paste it in there. And now the command prompt is pointed into that folder that I just created. Okay, now a couple of checks we want to do before we get started is we want to make sure that Node was installed correctly. We want to make sure that Node Package Manager has been installed. a couple other things just to make sure that we have everything we need. Now, when we install these apps, or they give us basically commands that we can use. Like cd is a built-in just DOS command that's been around forever. That's change directory. You got dir, right, directory. That's going to show you all the stuff inside. But there's some of these commands are actually just node commands. Other of them are npm commands for node package manager. Angular is going to have its own commands. So make this a little bigger. So as we go, we're just going to have to kind of know which command to type in to do what we want to do. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is check to see if node's installed. So I can type in node and then -v. Okay. And if I get a version back, then I know, okay, we're good to go. It recognizes the node's installed. I can use the node command. We're good to go. Okay. Next thing I want to check is the npm. It's kind of the same thing, npm-v, the V stands for version. Okay, that returns some numbers to me, so I know we're good to go. Okay, now another thing that Microsoft has been doing, which is kind of interesting, is they've been creating this new language called TypeScript. And it's kind of like Microsoft's version of JavaScript. They've created their own little version of JavaScript. It does everything JavaScript can do, except for it adds a really big feature that JavaScript currently doesn't have, and that's typescripting, which just means well, not typescripting, but it's typing variables. And when I say type variables, I don't mean just typing out variables. I mean you can tell the code what kind of variable you're going to be using. So really quick in JavaScript, if I'm just going to type it out in here. If I declared a variable called hi and I just set it equal to some string, or maybe it's just hey or something, JavaScript really doesn't know what kind of variable this is. The only way it can tell is just by seeing what it's equal to. Well, it's equal to a string, which is a character or a word or a sentence. So JavaScript just tries to figure it out. But with TypeScript, you can put a little colon here and I can say string. And what that means is I'm saying, okay, this variable hi is going to be a string, and the string that it's equal to is hey. All right, so that's one of the big things that TypeScript gives. And you'll see when we get into the code, there'll be TS extensions for these files, and the TS just stands for TypeScript. So the point of that is we need to make sure we have that installed. So we type in npm install, and then we're going to do -g. And what the -g means with all these commands is it's a global command. In other words, I'll have access to whatever I install here inside of Angular, the Angular app folder. I'll have access to it basically no matter where I am on my computer. Okay, so I'm going to do npm install -g, and I'm going to type in TypeScript. Okay, and that's going to install TypeScript to my computer. Okay, and we can see that it updated it. If I already had it installed, it'll just check to see what needs to be updated. If something needs to, it'll do it. And this is just the power of npm right here, is this just allows you to install any type of package that has been created, and there's a ton of them. And you'll see that kind of as we go. So now I need to install the Angular command line interface. So I'm going to do that with npm as well. Okay, so npm, and then I'm going to do install -g because I want this to be the global install as well. I'm going to say Angular/CLI. Okay, and this is the command that you use to get it there and grab the command line interface for Angular. So I'll hit enter with that. Now it's going to need to go out to the web, grab whatever it needs to do. So depending on how fast your internet is, depending how fast your computer is, this is going to take a while, or it may be semi-quick. Okay, so we got that installed. Now we're ready to do our Angular stuff. Okay, I got the CLI installed, TypeScript is good, I got Node and npm installed, and I got Angular ready. And now Angular commands are done with the command ng. So anytime you see ng, that means you're invoking the Angular command line interface. You're going to be doing something that the command line interface allows you to do inside of Angular. Okay, so I just want to create a new app, right? And I'm going to create it inside of Angular app. So that's the first thing we got to do, is make sure that inside the command prompt you're in the right location. And we already did that. We did that way up here, right, when we did the change directory. So I'm inside of Angular apps. That's exactly where I want to be. And I'm going to create my new app. So ng, and I'm going to do create, or nope, sorry, I'm going to go ng new, and then I'm going to name my app. And I'm going to call it just Star Wars quote. Nothing too fancy there. Can I hit enter? Now it's going to ask me a few things. It's going to say, hey, do you want to add routing? Routing is basically, it allows you to make different pages. It allows you to create different pages and create different routes that navigate to those pages. We're not going to do that in this example, so I'm just going to say N there for no, and hit enter. But if I knew it was going to be a full-fledged app with multiple pages and multiple sections, then I definitely would have said yes there. Now it's asking what kind of CSS, like what kind of styling I'm going to use. I'm just going to use the normal CSS. So I'm just going to pick that and hit enter. Okay, now this usually takes a little bit because, I mean, you see what it did here. It just created a ton of files. So we got angular.json. We're going to be going through a lot of these, not all of them, but some of them. It uses Git. If you're familiar with Git, you can create Git repositories and things like that. Karma, you can see, is kind of built in. It's that debugging tool. We got config type things. It automatically creates favicon. The favicons are those icons that show up in the tabs when you go to different websites. So it's just creating all the files, and it's creating all of the folder structure that we need for this app to work. And it's kind of crazy because when this is done, it's going to be around 200 megabytes of information. So just a normal Angular app that doesn't do anything really, it takes up a good amount of space. So just kind of be aware of that as you're installing these and playing around. Okay, but all this stuff is, I mean, it looks like, right, just a bunch of crazy output here. It's all normal, right? Now you may get some warnings sometimes. Not a big deal usually. It's just letting you know, hey, this has been updated or this is out of date is usually what they'll do with warnings. But really all we care about is just down here at the end where when it says successfully initialize Git, we know that everything's good. At least we hope so anyways. Okay, and if I double click, right, and I come take a look at this, there it is, created a new folder. And the name of the folder is the name of the app that we said, and you can see right there it's 240 megabytes. So it's a lot of stuff just for an empty app. So just be aware, okay? Now also it's worth mentioning though, once you compile this and get it ready for production and you upload it somewhere on a website, it's nowhere near that big. This is just for development. Because a big one is this node modules. And we'll go over that in a minute, but yeah, I mean, the node modules takes 240 megabytes. Node modules are just all of the modules that Node has that give you all of the different type of functionality that you may need, okay? And that's really all we need to talk about there, but that's what takes up most of this. And when you upload this stuff to the websites or up to hosts or servers or whatever, node modules doesn't go with it. So that saves a ton of space just right there. Okay, so now that I've created that, I want to take my command prompt and go into my app, right? Star Wars quote. So I'm just going to do change directory, okay, Star Wars quote. Now I got mine set up to where when I do a CD, I can type in the first letter that I want, and I can hit tab, and then that's going to auto-complete it for me. It's a cool little thing to know about when you're doing this. Just helps you to navigate through these directories a little bit easier. But anyway, so I typed in tab, brought me to Star Wars quote. I hit enter, so now I'm inside of Star Wars quote. And the first thing that we'll usually want to do here is get an idea if it's working, right? If the app's been installed correctly. Now, one of the things that comes with the app, which is really nice, is a built-in local server. So I don't need to install anything extra onto my computer to run this. All I got to do is run the server and see if it works, and then open it up and see if the app runs or not. Now I installed I did ng, right? I created a new app. Now another thing to check that I didn't go over is we can type in ng -- version. Okay, and that's going to give us all the information we need about the CLI. So what version of it we're using, what version of Node, what's our operating system, the version of Angular. It'll tell us all of the packages that we have as well, and so forth. So that's another common command to know that's a good one. Okay, anyways, so a couple things we want to do first. The first one is I'm going to say ng serve, and that's how you launch the server to kind of test your app and see if it's working. So I hit enter. This sometimes takes a while. It just kind of depends. But this is all code that needs to be compiled. So it gets compiled. It has to build different modules. Okay, sometimes it'll take a while. Sometimes it's kind of quick. This one wasn't too bad. And you'll see a bunch of green. Green means yay. Green means everything's good, right? And then it tells you how long it took. Okay, but the thing we really care about is right here, is where is it hosted? And it should be on localhost 42. Now to stop the server before we go to it, it's Control-C. Should be anyways, yep. You do Control-C, and then it's gonna say you wanna terminate the batch job, you just say yes, okay, and then the host is done. It doesn't work anymore. Now another way you can do this is ng serve, and you can do a --open, I think. Okay, and what that'll do is it compiles it, it runs the server, and then it will automatically open it in a browser so you don't have to go to it. Okay, you can see that it just automatically opened up the browser and took me to localhost 4200. So if you don't want to have to get it, I mean, I know I get lazy every once in a while. Sometimes I don't want to have to go do that. So if you just put the -- open on there, you should be good, and it'll just open it for you. Now, Angular is something that gets updated all the time, and I swear every week there's a new version is what it feels like. And just this beginning splash page is actually really new. It's probably only a few days, if a week old, or at least it is for me. I was doing new apps just like a week or so, and it was completely different. So this is completely new. This looks different, but this just means that, hey, it's working. You can come over here, click on new component, and this will give you kind of all of the common commands that you can run. And we're going to run 2 or 3 of these. Okay, but this means it's working, right? This means we're good to go, and everything is exactly kind of how we wanted it. So, okay. Anyways, so I'm going to leave this open. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to close it out here, because I do want to show you one more command. Okay, the next one is if you have Visual Studio installed, their command is code. So I can type in code and then type in whatever I want, and this is going to run Visual Studio type commands. And I can say code period, and then hit enter. And what that's going to do is open up Visual Studio Code in the folder that I currently have selected in my command prompt. Okay, which is pretty nice. So I don't have to go in here and do a file open folder or anything like that. It'll just open up Visual Studio Code and automatically put all this stuff in here for me. Okay. Oops. All right. So now what I'm going to do here is just run my server. And you can have multiple command prompts open, and that's kind of what I recommend, is just have one command prompt running the server, and then have another command prompt where you do your commands and you build your components and things like that. So now that my server is running here, I'm just going to kind of minimize that. And let's just take a really quick look at all. I'm not going to do all the files. It's going to take forever here, but we're just going to go over some of the important ones. So I'm inside of Star Wars Quote, that folder I created. Take a look at Angular JSON. This just has a lot of definitions and different things about the project itself. The more I don't know, the one you probably use the most is right here, styles. This defines what CSS styles you're going to use in the project. So I got one that's created by default. If I wanted to use Bootstrap or something like that, a CSS framework, I would need to put it in here. Okay, Karma is the debugging things. Package.json is all the one thing you may deal with a lot here is the dependencies. These are all the different things that the app may use. So you'll see that we'll be using core, we'll be using browser stuff, we'll be using common. There's different things that you would use. If I was using the routers, I'd be using router. But this is the stuff that you import into your app that extends the functionality of it, that allows it to work and do what you want. All right, that's about it there. The node modules, right? These are just all the modules. Well, probably not all of them, but a big chunk of the modules that Node has that allows you to do just all kinds of different really cool stuff. Okay, but we're not going to go through that. That would take forever. Okay, the folder you're going to be editing or working in most is this source folder, the SRC. Okay, here's our favicon. So if you wanted to change out the favicon, you could just save it out and replace it there. We got our styles.css that was defined in the Angular, right? Source/styles.css. So this is the file right here that kind of like the global styles. This will affect the styling of the whole app. Okay, we got index.html. We're going to go back to this, right? Index.html, that's the big building that we are talking about, right? This holds everything. And index.html is embedding this thing called app root. Okay, app root is defined inside of this app folder right here. Okay, so when I say I use this tag or this element called app root, what it's doing is it's taking everything that's inside of app component.html and it's embedding it onto the page. So if I take a look at this app component, all this stuff here that's inside of app component.html is what we're seeing here. Okay, all this stuff. So, okay, so we have that. So there's basically the content of that home page that we're seeing, and that's showing up because right here I've defined this is the app root that needs to be thrown in there. So that brings us to a question, well, how do we know what the tag's supposed to be? How do we know that it's supposed to be app-root, right? Well, that's defined inside of these component files, okay? Whenever you create a component, it comes with this app.component.ts file. TS, remember, is TypeScript, and this is where all that stuff is defined. So the selector is what the tag needs to be called. So app-root, I'll say that correct one of these days, right? So app-root is right here, right? And we used app-root because that's what it's defined right here. So when we create these components and we're putting components inside of the app, and even when you're putting components inside of components, if you ever forget, okay, what's the tag for this component? Well, that's defined right here under selector. Okay, and then template URL defines, okay, what's the HTML file that is going to be tied to this component. So this is what defines what the component's going to have inside of it. So we have app.component.html. So when you go here, now it knows what is going to be inside of that component. So when it defines it right here and says, okay, embed whatever app root is, it comes over here and says, okay, cool, this is app root. Now I need to know what the content's going to be. Well, the template URL defines what the content of that component's going to be. Okay, and then the style URLs is just that, it defines what styles it's going to be using. Okay, and that's a big chunk of Angular is just, okay, what component is embedded where? What is the content of it? Where do I go to change it? Because when you start getting more and more components, it gets a little more complex. But so we need to go, okay, we have all these components. How is all of that stuff controlled, right? Well, that's all in the app module. Okay, so the module file here defines, first of all, it imports browser module, which allows you to create apps in the browser. Okay, the ng module, this allows you to do functions and other types of things, which we'll cover later. But you can see that it imports the main component, which is the app component. It's importing this component here that we've created with this HTML file. Okay, every component that you create needs to be imported into this app module because this is what controls the whole app, basically. Okay, and then we have, so once you've imported it, then you have to declare it down here as well. Okay, and any other types of imports, which we will be doing later, you have to put them down here inside the import as well. Okay, and Bootstrap, this may confuse people with like the CSS framework Bootstrap, but this Bootstrap just means how the app gets compiled and built, basically, and it's telling it to build the app inside of app component. So when you hear Bootstrap and Angular talk, that means just the app being built. Okay. All right, so let's actually start putting stuff inside of here. Okay, let's actually start coding a little bit. Okay, so we're inside the module. I need to import a new, here, let me make this a little bigger. Okay, I'm going to import a new module here that we're going to need to use, and it's called the HTTP client module. Okay, and what this is going to allow us to do is go out and grab the Star Wars quote. Basically, it's going to allow us to go out to the web and grab some data, is what this lets us do. So HTTP client module is going to allow us to do that, and we're going to import that from Angular common HTTP. Now, one kind of cool thing that Visual Studio does is you can see how this kind of is dark. It's kind of grayed out a little bit. That means that it's saying, hey, look, you've imported it, but you haven't used it yet, or you haven't declared it, or you haven't finished importing it. Okay, and that's what I'm going to do down here is once I've imported it, I still have to add it to the imports list. Okay, so once I put it here and said, yeah, I'm importing it, and I do actually do the importing up here, everything's good, nothing's grayed out anymore, and we're ready to go. All right, so that's going to allow us to use the module that's going to let us go out and grab the information from the web. Okay, so we've taken a look at index, we've taken a look at app component, right? We haven't created the quote one yet, but we need to create, and we've taken a look at app module as well. Okay, but we need to create this service that's going to go out there and grab the data for us. Okay, so I'm going to do that in the command prompt, and you can actually do this inside of Visual Studio. It's another reason why a lot of people like it. We go to terminal, new terminal. Okay, and now I can run commands straight from my editor, which is really nice, and it puts me directly into the app folder, and that's great. Now this showed up a couple times because I accidentally hit enter a couple times, so that usually doesn't happen. Okay, but I'm going to do ng generate a service called API. Okay, and you can see what it did here is it created a TypeScript file for us called api.service. It gave us a spec file, which really we don't really use that much. At least I haven't used it a whole lot. Okay, and I'm going to close out of the terminal because we don't need that anymore. Okay, but this created this service. And remember, this is like us dropping our clothes off at a dry cleaner or something. Like we have a service that we want to subscribe to, that we want to use, that will do something for us. And that's what this service is going to do, is we want this service to go out there, grab the API information and pull it down so we can actually use it. Okay. So to be able to do that, right, I got to import the HTTP client stuff so I can actually go out there and grab things from the web. Okay, so Angular common HTTP. Okay, and again, it's going to kind of gray out here because it wants me to, it's like, okay, you imported it, but you're not using it. Now this is object-oriented stuff that I'm going to kind of mention here, but you have a constructor function which is going to build objects and do different things, and that's what we need here. Oh, and by the way, the injectable just basically, we're not going to be using it, but this is basically letting you know that you have injectables inside this root app, but we're not even going to use that, so we're not going to really mention it that much here. So inside the constructor, I'm going to pass in a private variable called HTTP, and I'm going to give it a type of HTTP client. In other words, this HTTP variable is going to have access to everything the HTTP client can do. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, inside of objects, you can have functionality. Inside of an object, you can call a function that lets you do something. And now I've just given this variable HTTP access to all the functionality the HTTP client has. And one of the functionalities of HTTP client is going out and grabbing API data. Okay. So inside of here, I'm going to create a new public. This is going to be a public function called getQuote, and that's what it's going to do. It's going to go out there and grab the quote. So when this function is called, it's going to return, and I'm going to say this dot. This refers to the service itself, and I'm going to say HTTP, and this, of course, is calling the variable I just created. So it's saying start out at this whole service. Inside the service, you're going to find a variable called HTTP, and inside of that variable, we're going to use a get function. And the get function is what goes out there and actually grabs the data from the website. Okay, so I'm going to put the website in there. Okay, so I'm just going to grab that link, and I'm going to throw it in there. Okay. And remember that get function, we can use that because we said HTTP is going to have access to all the stuff the HTTP client can do. And we imported it up here, so we're able to do that. Okay, now you got to know about basically where everything is. So we're right now inside of this service, okay, that's going to be able to be used by different parts of our app. Okay, and we made a public function called getQuote, so that's going to be called, and when that function gets called, it's going to return all the JSON data. And a quick thing about JSON. So JSON looks a lot like a JavaScript object if you're familiar with those. If not, don't worry, we'll talk about it. So an object has what are called key value pairs. Think of them as basically variables. It's just a bunch of variables inside of this object. So it's saying ID is equal to 47. It's saying Star Wars quote is equal to I am no Jedi, right? And then its faction is equal to 0. So if I were to access this and I wanted to get some of this information, I would have to go to the variable where this whole object is stored inside of, and then I would just use dot notation. So if I wanted to grab the ID, I would say, okay, the variable that this is stored into dot ID, and then that would give me 47. Or I could say the variable that this is stored inside dot faction, and that's going to give me 0. Of course, I don't want those. I want the quote. So once I get this stuff stored inside of a variable, I'm going to say that variable dot Star Wars quote, and then I'm actually going to be able to pull that quote from the API here. Okay, and we're not that far yet, but that's what we're going to be doing is we're going to, once we have that JSON data loaded, then we can navigate through it and pull out what we need to. Okay, so once we call this getQuote function, it's going to return the JSON data. Then we just need to save that JSON data in a variable and then pull out whatever we need to pull out. Okay, so that's our service. Okay, now we're going to go back to the terminal here, and we're going to create a component. So I'm going to say ng generate component. And also there's a quick way of doing this. You can see ng-gc, and that'll work as well. G is short for generate, of course, and C is short for component. But I'll type it out here just so we can see it. So I'm going to generate a component, and I am going to call it quote. And we can see it creates everything for us over here. Now we have this drop down with all the quote component stuff. And what I think is really nice is if I go back to the app module, notice how it already did all the importing for us, which is really nice. This is why the CLI is really helpful. The command line interface is it'll do a lot of this automatically for us. So it went in there and imported the quote component for us. And then down here, it put it in the declarations. So we don't even have to update that. It does it for us, which is really nice. Okay, and if we also take a look, if we compare the quote component to the app component, they're really similar. They both have CSS files, right? They both have HTML files. They both have spec files, and they both have component files. Okay, and they're really similar. Now all we need to pay attention to is the order, basically, like what's inside of what, right? App root is the root component of this whole thing that's put inside of index. Well, now app is going to be something, or the quote component is going to be inside of the app component. So you got to pay attention to how those relationships work, really, to make sure that you know what components are inside of what components. Just like if you're navigating through a building, you need to know what office you need to go to, then you need to know what room you're going to. It's similar stuff. Okay, so anyways, so we created that. Now I'm going to go to this component. Let me close out of that and get a little bit more space here. Okay, I'm going to head over to the component file for the quote. And this is where you define all of the variables and functions and stuff that the quote component can use. Okay, so if I create a function in here, the quote component can use it, but if I want, you know, the app component to be able to use this kind of stuff, you have to do other things. But for now, I'm just going to be creating all the variables and such that I just want the quote component to be able to use. Okay, and that's the API data stuff. So I got to import that service. I got to import that API service that I just created so it can actually pull information from it. Okay, now we got to take a look at where we're at. We're inside of the quote folder. We need to go up a folder and run this service, right? So we can have access to it. So I have to say .. That's going to take me up a folder. And then this is where you know, Visual Studio is pretty helpful. So I went up a folder and now this is what I have access to, and I want to grab the API service. So I can just throw that in there. Again, it's being grayed out because I'm not using it. Well, I am going to use it down here in my class inside the constructor, just like we did before. Create a private variable. I'm going to call it API serve. And it's going to have access to everything API service has. Well, what does API service has? API service has that function get quote, and that's what I need to call because I need to call that function, get that JSON data so I can display it inside of this component. Okay, so API service, I created this variable called API serve. Okay, it's a type of API service, so now it has access to everything API service can do. Okay, now all I got to do is create, well, I'm going to create a variable called Qt for quote. Okay, and I'm going to type it to an object, and I'm going to set it equal to an empty object. This is going to be the variable that I'm going to populate the JSON data with. So Qt is going to have access, and it will be populated with everything that this API returns to me, everything that it gives me. All right, so now I hop down here, ng on init. So ng on init is a function that runs on initialization. In other words, when the app starts to run. When this component gets called and is loaded, this function is going to run. Okay, so I'm going to say this, which refers to this component, right? The quote component, this.API serve, right? Because that's the variable I created up here that has access to everything the API service can do. And I'm going to run that function, get quote. Okay, remember that quote's inside of our service. Okay, and I'm going to subscribe, or in other words, receive the data that get quote returns to us. Because remember, if I come back here, right? Oops, not there. The service, it's returning, right? So whatever called this function get quote is going to get this JSON data back. Okay, so I'm going to subscribe to that, and I'm going to store what's returned inside of a variable called data, and I'm going to use this fat arrow syntax, which just basically means it's a short way to write a function. Okay, so this would be basically function data inside of parentheses, so I'm receiving back what's inside of data, and then I'm just going to return whatever I do down here. And then I'm just going to say this.qt is equal to data. Okay, and that's it. Now I have all the JSON data stored inside of Qt. So again, right, goes out to the API service, right? Because API serve has everything the API service can do. We run that get quote function from the service. We subscribe to it. It's just like if you subscribe to a newspaper, you're going to get a newspaper every day. It's kind of the same thing. I'm subscribing to this get quote function. So whatever is returned, I'm going to receive that because I've subscribed to it, and I'm going to store it inside of data. Okay, and then I grab all that information that was stored inside of data, and then I set it equal to Qt. So Qt is now equal to all of this JSON data that we just went out and grabbed. So now if I want something to come out, all I got to do is say qt.id. Right, that's what we were talking about. I can say, well, it's like forcing me to do this, but so qt.id, right, would give me 47. qt.faction is going to give me 0. qt.starwarsquote is going to give me my actual quote, and that's what I want. All right, so inside of this component file, I have access inside of my HTML file. I can call anything that I've created inside of this component file, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to just come over here and change my content to just a Star Wars quote. Okay, we're changing the content of the quote component inside the HTML file, just like over here on the app component, right? All of this stuff is what we're seeing. Not there. Where am I? The heck, there it is. So everything we're seeing here, right, is located in here. Well, this component is going to be a piece of this website. So when I embed this quote component, everything that I put in here is going to show up. Okay, now to get access to those variables, right, this variable qt, which I need, you use what's called the double curly bracket syntax, or I've heard it called the double mustache syntax. But I'm going to say qt.starwarsquote. Okay, because again, I want to go to this JSON data, get it going to Qt, which holds, right, all of this information. .starwarsquote is going to give me the value of that key right here. Okay, so this is how you access variables and such that are defined over here in this component. And I can do it because this is the HTML file for quote, the quote component's HTML file. And this is where all the stuff, all the code and things that I'm going to be using are located. Okay, so that Qt is how I can access the variable over here, Qt. Now I've saved all this. I come over, right? I'm still not seeing anything because I haven't embedded it inside of this component. I haven't taken my quote component right here that I just created, right, with the quote being printed out, and I haven't put it inside of this app component because this is what's showing up on the page right now. So what I'm going to do is I don't really care about anything underneath resources. So I'm going to take everything in resources and just get rid of it. So I'm going to do a search for resources. Okay. Just going to erase all of it. Okay, and then when I save it, notice how it just automatically refreshed. And if we come over here, it's going to give us kind of like a server log of all the things updating and stuff. But everything's gone now. Okay, so what I want now is right underneath resources, I want to put in that component. I want to put in my quote component. And so if I forgot how to do that, I can come over here to the component and look at my selector. If I want to insert everything that's inside of this HTML file here, I have to use the app quote tag. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Come inside of my app component, then right underneath here, I just put in app quote. Okay, and that's going to, when it runs this, it's going to find that and go, okay, cool, app quote. Checks out this, okay, this is app quote. That's where I'm going to put in. So then it knows to put in all the content from this HTML file, which is right there. And then it should combine the two. Okay, and then there we go. And now it's running and it's showing up. Now, another thing to pay attention to, sometimes stuff like this won't work. And if it's not working, it's sometimes helpful to just stop your server and just compile it again. Sometimes when you're going out and grabbing stuff from a different website, it may not work as well as it should. So sometimes just stopping the server, recompiling it will actually get it to work. And I was actually practicing this beforehand. I was going through it a couple times and that it didn't work. And I had to stop the server and recompile, and then it worked just fine. Okay, anyways, so yeah, right, we got our index, which has app component embedded into it. The quote component is embedded inside of the app component, right? And then the quote component used that API service to go out there and grab the information. All right, just a couple things before we wrap up and see if we have any questions here. But if this semi interested you, right, if you want to learn more, you can head over, right, to our website, skillforge.com. Just mouse over the courses, and these are all the different things we have. Even if you're not interested in Angular, or maybe there's other, well, I mean, obviously you are because you're here, but there's a bunch of other web design stuff, right, as well. We got classes and all kinds of really cool stuff. So whether it's web design, programming, whatever, you can take a look. But you can come here to Angular, right? You head over to the Angular training. Okay, and then just kind of gives you a little description. You can click on this, and then this will take you into the page where you can see the timeline, the price. If you want an on-site course, right, you can contact us and set something up. Here's the overview, requisites, the course outline, and so forth. And if you do join the course, we'll be building something that kind of looks like this. It uses routing. It uses all kinds of different things. We can go to projects here, and this is looping through JSON data to basically pull information. You hit edit. You can edit the information, and this is all online. We show you how to host it online. So this is actually hosted live. So that's another kind of cool thing that we do with that. But anyways, yeah, that's all I got. I know there was a question kind of in the middle. I tried to look at it, but the chat box sometimes in this Zoom room isn't the best, and it's hard to see. So I only have a few more minutes, but any general questions or any questions about the code or anything before we wrap up here? Okay, so Ali asked, if you installed the version 10 and this page doesn't show up. Yeah, because I updated my command line interface, because I updated that, it was giving me that new page. Now, it doesn't really matter because when you're making your own app, you're going to end up getting rid of all that stuff anyways, just kind of like we saw here, right? I go into the app component, and I got rid of like half of it. But when you're creating your own stuff, you're going to pretty much get rid of all of this anyways, and then start creating your own components and your own pieces of the app. So that's something you really don't need to worry too much about. All right, any other questions? Put them in the chat. You can put them in the question and answer box. But if not, let me put the little Angular link in here just in case you're wanting to take a look. This will be in the chat, maybe. Again, chat is always buried. All right, throw that in there. Take a look. Yeah, that's all I have, guys. So if you don't have any questions, feel free to take off. Thanks for coming. And oh, actually, one other thing I can put here is, gosh, that chat. I'll put in my email. So if you have any questions or anything about this here, feel free to email me. No worries. If you have any just basic questions about Angular or whatever, go for it. Shoot me off an email. I'd love to hear from you guys, or any feedback or anything for this webinar. That'd be really helpful too. So anyways, that's all I have. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon.